The bell had barely stopped ringing when Emily slid into her usual seat in the third row, her notebook already open, pencil poised. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that made the sunlight sharper as it streamed to the tall windows of Jefferson High. Emily liked mornings like this. They made her feel sharper too. She had always been one of those students who thrived on answering questions, on the little thrill of raising her hand and having her thoughts validated. She didn't do it to show off. She simply loved learning, loved the dance of ideas in the air. Mr. Collins, the history teacher, strode in with his usual brisk steps, dropping a stack of papers on his desk. He had a reputation for being strict, even intimidating. Emily didn't mind that much. She believed if you did your work and paid attention, you had nothing to fear. That morning, he began the lesson on the Reconstruction era. His voice was firm, his chalk quick on the board. Emily listened closely, tracing his words into her notebook. When he asked a question about the economic challenges of the South after the Civil War, her hand shot up before she even realized it. "Yes, Emily," he said, glancing at her briefly. Her heart thumped with that familiar anticipation. "Well, I think one of the major challenges was a transition from a slave-based economy to one that had to pay wages. That shift disrupted the agricultural system and—" She didn't get to finish. Mr. Collins's hand sliced the air, cutting her off. His eyes narrowed, and in a tone that felt more like a slap than a sentence, he said, "Don't act smart. Girls shouldn't talk so much." It was almost casual the way he said it, like he was brushing off lint. But the words hung heavy in the room, and the space between the desks seemed to shrink. There was a sudden stillness, broken only by a few muffled snickers from the back. Emily felt every eye on her, some amused, some uncomfortable, a few looking anywhere but at her. Heat flooded her cheeks. Her voice caught somewhere in her throat, and she lowered her hand slowly, as though afraid to draw more attention to it. The lesson continued as if nothing had happened, but the air had changed. Emily kept her eyes on her notebook, though the lines of her handwriting began to wobble. She told herself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. Still, her chest felt tight, and every minute after that stretched endlessly. By the time the bell rang, she was the first one out of the room. She walked fast down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in a blur of lockers and chatter. Her friends caught up to her, but she brushed off their half-hearted jokes about Mr. Collins being old-fashioned or just grumpy. None of them seemed to understand that it wasn't just about that one comment. It was the way it took something she loved, speaking up, sharing ideas, and made it feel dangerous. That night, as she sat at her desk doing homework, the words replayed in her mind. She could still hear the precise cadence. "Don't act smart. Girls shouldn't talk so much." The more she thought about it, the more it hollowed her out from the inside. The next day, she didn't raise her hand. Or the day after that. At first, she told herself she was just being cautious. But caution soon became habit. She discovered she could sit through an entire class without saying a word, and no one seemed to notice. In fact, it was easier, safer. Weeks turned into months. Emily's grades stayed strong, but her teachers began to see her as quiet or reserved, not realize it was a choice she had made under duress. Friends grew used to her listening more than speaking. The less she said, the more invisible she felt. And a strange part of her liked that. Invisibility meant she couldn't be humiliated again. She didn't tell her parents. How could she? They would have called the school, and that would have made everything worse. She decided the best thing to do was bury the memory and move on. But she couldn't unhear those words, and over time, they became part of her inner script, whisper reminders to stay small. By the time she reached the end of the school year, Emily had mastered the art of silence. It wasn't just in history class. She stopped volunteering in science, in literature, even in the art room where she used to love explaining her work. Her voice had become something private, something she kept locked away. And though she told herself it was just temporary, a part of her feared she might never truly get it back. What Emily didn't know was that this single moment, this 10-second exchange in a sunlit classroom, would ripple through years of her life, shaping her choices in ways she wouldn't fully understand until much later. By the time Emily reached her final years of high school, her silence had become second nature. It wasn't something she consciously decided each day. It was simply the way she moved through the world. She wrote her thoughts in essays. She crafted careful arguments in written form. But when discussions took place around her, she let them pass like trains she never boarded. In the cafeteria, she listened to conversations rather than joined them, smiling when appropriate, but rarely offering more. Her friends sometimes teased her about how little she spoke, but they had grown used to it, accepting her as a quiet one. Teachers praised her written work, but often overlooked her during oral activities, assuming she preferred to stay in the background. In college, the silence followed her, though the environment was different. The university buzzed with ideas, open debates on the lawn, animated discussions in classrooms, impromptu performances, and lectures. Emily admired the students who could stand up in a crowded seminar and defend their views with confidence. She often thought about what she might say if she could push her voice past the tightness in her chest. But the fear was always there, subtle and unyielding. It wasn't fear of being wrong exactly, but that same sting she had felt once before, the public dismissal that could flatten her in seconds. She majored in sociology, drawn to the way it examined systems, inequality, and human behavior. The more she studied, the more she recognized the quiet mechanisms that kept certain voices out of conversation, and the patterns that made some people speak, while others held back. In group projects, she volunteered to compile research, write summaries, or prepare slides. When it came time to present, she offered to handle the technical setup while her peers spoke. It was a division of labor that suited everyone, or so she thought. In her third year, she enrolled in a research seminar led by Professor Janet Morales, a woman whose presence filled the room not through volume, but through focus. Professor Morales had a way of leaning forward when a student spoke, as though each word carried weight. She noticed details others missed, a slight hesitation, a moment of insight buried in casual remarks. Emily liked her from the start. The seminar's final project required students to investigate a topic of their choice and present their findings at a small symposium organized by the department. Emily's group chose to examine the link between classroom participation and academic confidence. For weeks, she buried herself in articles, statistics, and interviews. Her written contributions were meticulous, layered with analysis and examples. One afternoon, while reviewing the group's progress, Professor Morales called Emily aside. "I've been reading your work," she said, tapping the pages of Emily's latest draft. "You have a depth of understanding here that isn't coming through in our discussions. Why is that?" Emily hesitated, caught between reflex and honesty. "I'm better at writing than speaking," she said. "Perhaps," Morales replied, "but sometimes ideas need to be heard to have the impact they deserve." She studied Emily's face for a moment before continuing. "I'd like you to present part of the findings at the symposium. Just a few minutes. I think it would serve the research in you very well." Emily's instinct was to refuse. The thought of standing in front of even a small audience sent a cold ripple down her spine. But there was something in the professor's voice, an assurance that felt different from the pressure she had experienced in the past. She nodded slowly, though the decision sat in her stomach like a stone. The weeks leading up to the symposium were a quiet battle with herself. She practiced her section aloud in her dorm room, the words sounding strange in the open air. She noticed how her voice trembled when she reached certain phrases, how her mouth went dry after just a few sentences. But she also noticed something else. When she read her own sentences out loud, they carried a conviction she hadn't expected. The day of the symposium arrived with a cold drizzle, the kind that turned the campus pathways slick and reflective. The event was held in a modest lecture hall, with rows of folding chairs and a simple podium at the front. As Emily set up the projector for her group, her palms were damp. She kept her eyes on the screen, avoiding the sight of people trickling in, chatting softly as they took their seats. When it was her turn to speak, she walked the podium with deliberate steps. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she kept her gaze fixed on the notes in her hands. The first sentence came out quieter than she intended, but the microphone caught it, carrying her voice across the room. She spoke about the patterns in their data, the interviews that revealed how early experiences shaped students' confidence. At first, she didn't dare to look up, but as she continued, she caught sight of a man in the front row jotting down notes, a woman nodding slightly. someone in the back leaning forward as if to hear more. It wasn't a flawless delivery. She stumbled once, her voice catching for a moment, but she finished without losing her place. When she stepped back, there was a ripple of polite applause. Emily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That night, alone in her dorm, she replayed the moment, not the stumbles or the nervousness, but the way the room had listened. It was the first time in years that her words had lived outside the page, and the sound of them still lingered in her ears. She didn't yet know what it meant, but something in her had shifted, as if a locked door had creaked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Emily's memory of that first symposium presentation didn't fade. Instead, it lingered and took root, growing quietly in the background of her life. In the months that followed, she found herself speaking up just a little more during class discussions, testing her voice in short bursts. She still wasn't the one to leap in at the first opportunity, but when she had something to contribute, she was more willing to let the words escape her mouth. Her professors noticed. Some encouraged her with a simple nod or a follow-up question, small gestures that carried more weight than they probably realized. By her final year, Emily had chosen to focus her thesis on the intersection of education policy and gender equality. The topic was demanding, requiring interviews with teachers, school administrators, and former students. She spent hours recording conversations, often hearing stories of subtle but lasting discouragement, a teacher who overlooked certain students, a comment that made someone retreat from a subject they loved, an environment where some voices were consistently prioritized over others. As she transcribed the interviews, she saw herself in the margins of these stories, as though she was piecing together a collective experience that included her own. It was at one of these local academic events, a regional conference for young researchers, that the turning point arrived. Emily had been invited to present her preliminary findings alongside other students from neighboring universities. The event was larger than the small symposium she had experienced before, a ballroom in a downtown hotel, its high ceiling strung with soft lighting, rows of chairs stretching back farther than she could easily see. There was a stage this time, and a lectern with a sleek microphone instead of the small podium she was used to. In the minutes before her panel began, Emily paced near the side of the stage. Her fellow presenters chatted easily, swapping anecdotes about their projects, but she was focused on the rhythm of her breathing, keeping it steady. When her name was called, she stepped forward into the bright wash of the stage lights. Her outline reflected faintly in the glass windows behind her. She began with a simple introduction, grounding herself in the research rather than in the awareness of the audience. Soon she was sharing key statistics, weaving them with short excerpts from her interviews. The words came with a rhythm she hadn't expected, and she found herself glancing up more often, meeting eyes in the crowd. She saw people scribbling in notebooks, heads nodding at certain points. When she spoke about the long-term consequences of silenced voices in education, she noticed a stillness settle over the audience, the kind of silence that meant they were really listening. When she finished, the applause was warm, sustained. She returned to her seat, her hands tingling from the adrenaline. A few minutes later, during the Q&A portion, a woman in the audience raised her hand and asked how Emily had become interested in this topic. It was a simple question, but it made Emily pause. She could have spoken vaguely about academic interest or trends in policy. Instead, she took a slow breath and said, "Part of it comes from personal experience. I know what it feels like to have your voice dismissed when you're young. I know how long it can take to speak again." The words hung in the air, unpolished but honest. She didn't offer details, but the audience didn't need them. They seemed to understand. Several people approached her afterward. Fellow students, professors from other universities, even a journalist covering the conference, asking to hear more about her research and, in some cases, about her own journey. One woman, a teacher from a rural district, told Emily quietly, "Your talk reminded me to be careful with my words in classroom. I don't want to be the reason a student stops raising her hand." The momentum from that conference carried into the months ahead. Emily received invitations to speak at other events, some small, others more formal. At first, she accepted them cautiously, choosing those that felt manageable. But with each one, her confidence solidified. She learned how to adjust her pacing, how to pause deliberately instead of rushing, how to let her voice carry without strain. The more she spoke, the more she felt that the years of silence had not erased her voice, but had given it a different kind of strength. It was during a quiet afternoon in early spring that the unexpected email arrived. She was in the campus library, sifting through the final chapters of her thesis, when the subject line caught her eye: Invitation to Speak, Global Education Forum. The body of the email explained that the conference would be held in Geneva with an audience of educators, policymakers, and activists from around the world. Her presentation would be streamed live to millions. The invitation mentioned that her recent research and conference presentations had drawn attention, and they believed her voice would contribute meaningfully to the event's theme: inclusive education for all. Emily stared at the screen for a long time, reading the email over and over. The magnitude of it pressing on her, both exhilarating and terrifying. She thought of the girl she had been years ago, sitting small and silent in a high school classroom, and for a moment, the distance between then and now felt impossible. Yet here it was, the kind of opportunity she had never imagined. She closed her laptop, her pulse quickening, already sensing that if she accepted, nothing in her life would be quite the same again. The weeks leading up to the Global Education Forum felt like living in a strange duality. On one side, there was the excitement, the meticulous preparation of slides, the crafting of every sentence in her speech so that it carried both clarity and conviction. On the other side, there was a quiet, constant current of nerves, that low hum of doubt that would rise without warning in the middle of the night. Emily would wake and stare at the ceiling, imagining the vast hall in Geneva, the faces from every continent, the cameras broadcasting her words into homes and offices across the world. The scale of it seemed unreal, yet each passing day brought it closer. When she finally boarded the plane, her notes were already worn from handling. She had rehearsed not just the content, but the cadence. When to pause, when to lean forward slightly, when to let a sentence rest in the air before moving on. In the seat beside her, an older woman struck up polite conversation, asking why she was traveling to Switzerland. Emily hesitated, then said simply, "I'm giving a talk at a conference." The woman smiled warmly and wished her luck, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily held on to that small gesture for the rest of the flight. Geneva in early summer was a city of contrasts. The crisp blue of the lake against the deep green of the mountains, the quiet elegance of its streets lined with flags from across the world. The conference venue itself was imposing, a modern building with vast glass panels reflecting the sky, its lobby buzzing with conversations in multiple languages. Delegates in suits, educators in patterned scarves, students clutching notepads, all moved with a purpose that made Emily's steps feel both smaller and more significant. The morning of her speech, she dressed with deliberate care, choosing a simple navy dress and a light blazer. She pinned her conference badge to her lapel, her name in bold letters beneath the title, Researcher, Inclusive Education. She spent the first hours listening to other speakers, passionate educators from rural Africa, policymakers from South America, activists from Asia. Each one brought their own urgency, their own reasons for fighting for a better educational system. By the time her turn approached, the weight of their stories only deepened her resolve. Backstage, she could hear the muffled voice of the host introducing her, listing her research focus and the growing recognition of her work. She took one steadying breath before stepping out into the light. The stage was wide, the ceiling high, the audience stretching out in a sea of faces. She placed her notes on the lectern, glanced briefly at them, and then let her eyes lift to the crowd. She began with the facts, statistics on participation gaps, studies showing how early classroom experiences shape confidence and long-term engagement. Her voice was steady, almost academic at first, each sentence measured. But as she moved deeper into her talk, something shifted. She spoke not just as a researcher, but as someone who had felt the quiet erosion of confidence firsthand. Without naming anyone, without recounting every detail, she described a moment in her youth when a single comment had been enough to make her retreat. She let the silence hang for a moment before continuing, her words gaining force. "The truth," she said, scanning the rows before her, "is that educators hold a power they often underestimate. A word of encouragement can open a door that stays open for a lifetime. A word of dismissal can close it so tightly that years may pass before it opens again, if it opens at all. She told him how she had found her voice again, not by erasing the past, but by choosing to speak in spite of it. She urged him to see every raised hand in their classrooms as a moment of trust, a risk taken by a young mind. She spoke about the responsibility that came with shaping not just knowledge, but self-worth. And then she looked directly into one of the cameras, aware that somewhere beyond that lens, countless people were watching. The world, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, needs girls who speak, and it needs classrooms that make space for them to be heard. The hall was still for a breathless moment after she finished. Then the applause began, a wave that grew and grew until it filled the space. She stepped back from the lectern, almost overwhelmed by the sound. People were on their feet, clapping not just politely, but with a kind of insistence that felt like agreement, like a shared promise. From the stage, she could not see individual faces clearly, but somewhere, in a living room thousands of miles away, Mr. Collins sat watching the broadcast. His remote rested on the table beside him, untouched since she began speaking. The name Emily had caught his attention during the introduction, but it was the words and the pointed clarity of her closing line that held him there. He said nothing, but he did not change the channel. In the days after the conference, Emily's inbox became an unexpected flood of messages. At first, she thought it was simply colleagues or attendees offering polite thanks. But as she read through them, she realized they were coming from far beyond the walls of Geneva. There were letters from teachers in small towns, from young women in university dorms, from parents who had watched the live stream with their daughters. Each message carried its own story. A shy girl who decided to audition for the debate team, a teacher who promised to rethink the way she handled class participation, a student who had been told by a classmate to stop trying to sound smart and now felt less alone. One email stood out in particular. It was from a 16-year-old named Sophia, who wrote from a small city in Argentina. She explained that her school had recently shown Emily's speech in a teacher training session, and afterward, she had gathered the courage to ask more questions in class. When you said the world needs girls who speak, Sophia wrote, I felt like you were talking directly to me. I'm not ready to speak in front of everyone yet, but I'm starting. Emily reread that email several times, thinking of the way courage often begins as a whisper before it becomes a voice. Her phone also began to ring with new opportunities, invitations to contribute to policy panels, to advise nonprofit organizations working on gender equity in education, to collaborate on research projects that bridge academia and practice. She accepted many of them, though carefully, ensuring she had time to continue her own work. Traveling more frequently, she visited schools in rural and urban settings alike, meeting students and teachers face to face. She often found herself in classrooms where the air was thick with hesitation, where the students had learned to speak only when spoken to. And in those rooms, she would share her belief that participation wasn't about being the loudest, but about being heard when you had something to say. Her speech from Geneva took on a life of its own, circulating online with translations in multiple languages. She was surprised the first time someone quoted it back to her during a conversation. The world needs girls who speak, a teacher in Nairobi said, smiling as she shook Emily's hand. It's already in our training materials. At a conference in Canada, a young woman approached her, notebook in hand, and said she had used Emily's words as the opening line in her own scholarship essay. Emily realized then that the sentence, simple as it was, had become more than her closing remark. It had become a rallying point. Back home, she settled into a rhythm that was new but deeply fulfilling. Her days were divided between research, writing, and speaking engagements. She had begun drafting a book, weaving together her personal journey with the voices of the countless people she had met who shared similar experiences. Her desk was covered with transcripts, highlighted studies, and sticky notes marked with fragments of thought. Sometimes she worked late into the night, driven not by deadlines but by the urgency of the subject. She never heard directly from Mr. Collins. A part of her had wondered if he might reach out, not to apologize necessarily, but to acknowledge the connection between the girl in his class and the woman on the stage. But the silence no longer carried the weight it once had. She had come to understand that her work was not about reclaiming something from him, but about ensuring that others did not lose their voices in the same way she once had. The absence of his words mattered less than the presence of so many others. Still, there were moments when she thought about that old classroom, about the sunlight on the desks and the heat in her cheeks. Those memories no longer tightened her throat. Instead, they served as reminders of the distance she had traveled. She could stand in front of thousands now, but she never forgot what it felt like to be unable to speak in front of 20. It made her more patient when she met someone hesitating to contribute, more attentive when a student's voice trembled with uncertainty. The movement she had unintentionally sparked continued to grow. Schools incorporated her message into curricula. Teacher training programs included segments on the power of language in shaping confidence, and advocacy groups used her research to push for policy changes that valued student participation as much as academic performance. Emily found herself in rooms where decisions were being made, no longer as an observer, but as someone whose input carried weight. One evening, after returning from a speaking engagement abroad, she sat by the window in her apartment, the city lights flickering against the glass. She opened her laptop and began answering more emails. A teacher from India, a mother from Sweden, a student from Kenya. As she wrote, she realized that the voices reaching out to her were not just echoes of her own. They were building something new, a collective sound that was louder, stronger, and impossible to silence. And for the first time, she fully understood that her journey had never been only about finding her own voice, but about making space for others to find theirs.